Hello, friend. Welcome to Science for Sleep. Every year, the same ideas tend to surface. Getting healthier, eating better, going to the gym, reading more books, starting a business, learning a new skill, picking up an instrument, changing a routine that no longer feels right. Even people who say they don't believe in New Year's resolutions usually have at least one quiet intention in the background. Something small, something unfinished, something they imagine might finally fit if the timing were right. And that timing always seems to be the same. January 1st. There is nothing physically different about this day. The light does not change all at once. The weather does not reset. The body wakes up the same way it did the day before. And yet, the day feels different anyway. People pause, they reflect, they look forward. This happens across cultures, ages, and lifestyles. Whether someone wants to improve their health, change their habits, or simply feel more in control of their time, the impulse appears again and again at the start of the year. Which raises a simple question. Why this day? Why does the beginning of a calendar year feel like a moment where change becomes more imaginable? And more importantly, is there any science behind the idea that setting a New Year's resolution actually helps, even if the resolution is never perfectly followed? Most conversations around resolutions focus on discipline or failure, on whether someone sticks with it long enough, on gym attendance dropping by February, on goals that fade as the year goes on. But the science tells a quieter story, a story that has less to do with willpower and more to do with how the human brain experiences time, identity, and possibility. When people think about New Year's resolutions, they often picture dramatic change, before and after. Old habits disappearing, new routines locking into place. But the brain rarely works in sudden transformations. It works through perception, framing, and gradual shifts. The start of a new year acts as a signal, not a command. Not a demand, but a signal. The calendar turning creates a psychological boundary, one that separates what came before from what might come next. And this boundary changes how the brain organizes memory, motivation, and attention. Even the act of thinking about a resolution before any action is taken activate systems in the brain related to planning and future simulation. The brain begins quietly mapping possibilities. Not in detail, not all at once, but just enough to reduce uncertainty. Uncertainty is effortful. Direction, even loose direction, is calming. This is one of the least discussed benefits of New Year's resolutions. They don't only exist to produce results. They exist to give the brain a sense of orientation, a sense that time is moving forward with some kind of shape. And that shape matters. From a biological standpoint, humans are not designed to live in endless, unmarked time. We rely on cycles, day and night, work and rest, seasons, beginnings and endings. These cycles help regulate attention and emotional load. The new year is one of the largest cycles we experience. It is shared, it is predictable, and it is symbolic. That symbolism alone is enough to change how thoughts feel. The same idea, I want to take better care of myself, can feel heavy in the middle of November and strangely light on January 1st. The content of the thought hasn't changed. The timing has. This video is not about motivation tricks. It is not about forcing habits to stick. And it is not about judging whether resolutions are kept or abandoned. Instead, it is about understanding what happens underneath the surface. What actually changes in the brain when a person decides to begin again. Why that decision feels meaningful even before action follows. And how resolutions can be beneficial, quietly, subtly, regardless of whether they unfold exactly as planned. Because when viewed through a scientific lens, New Year's resolutions are not promises we either keep or break. They are signals the brain knows how to respond to. And understanding that response changes how we see the entire tradition. I'm glad you're here. Long before calendars were printed or dates were tracked digitally, humans still marked time. They watched the sun rise and set. They noticed seasons shifting. They remembered when something began and when it ended. This instinct to divide time is not cultural decoration. It is neurological. The human brain does not experience time as a smooth, uninterrupted stream. Instead, it naturally organizes life into segments. Days feel different from nights. Weeks feel different from months. Certain moments stand out, while others blur together. These divisions help the brain manage memory. Events that occur within the same perceived period tend to be grouped together. Moments that fall on opposite sides of a boundary feel more distant from one another, even when only hours apart. This is why last year can feel far away, even when it ended only days ago. The brain uses time markers as organizing tools. Without them, experience becomes continuous and heavy. Everything blends together. Reflection becomes harder. Change feels vague. When time has no edges, it offers no contrast. Contrast is what makes meaning visible. From a biological perspective, segmentation reduces cognitive load. The brain does not need to hold everything at once. It can store the past as a completed unit and approach the future as something not yet filled in. This is one reason beginnings feel lighter. They are empty spaces. An empty space requires less effort to hold than a crowded one. When a new segment of time begins, the brain experiences a brief reduction in mental clutter. Previous events feel archived. New possibilities feel unburdened by detail. This effect is subtle but consistent. Studies in cognitive psychology show that people naturally assign meaning to temporal boundaries. They remember events differently depending on whether they happened before or after a perceived transition. Even artificial boundaries, like the start of a week or month, can change how actions are evaluated. The brain treats before and after as different categories. This categorization is useful. It allows humans to learn from the past without feeling permanently attached to it. It creates psychological distance without requiring emotional detachment. Distance is not avoidance. It is perspective. When time is segmented, the brain gains perspective automatically. It can observe patterns rather than relive moments. It can consider change without feeling overwhelmed by continuity. The new year is one of the strongest examples of this effect. Unlike smaller markers, it represents a full cycle completed, a closing and an opening occurring together. The brain recognizes this completion, even if life itself feels ongoing. Completion brings relief. It signals that something has been contained. This does not mean the past disappears. Memories remain, habits persist, but they are framed differently. They belong to a finished chapter rather than an ongoing one. This framing alters how thoughts feel when they arise. An idea about change does not land on top of everything else. It lands in open space. An open space invites exploration rather than resistance. Humans did not evolve to experience time abstractly. They evolved to experience it through cycles, rhythms, and transitions. These patterns help regulate attention, emotion, and motivation without conscious effort. When a new year begins, the brain is doing what it has always done. It is recognizing a boundary, reorganizing memory, and preparing for whatever comes next. Not urgently, not forcefully, but naturally. This quiet restructuring sets the stage for everything that follows. Once the brain learns to divide time, it begins to notice certain moments more than others. These moments stand out not because anything dramatic happens, but because they feel like edges, boundaries, points where one stretch of time ends and another quietly begins. Psychologists refer to these moments as temporal landmarks. A temporal landmark is any point in time that feels distinct enough to separate before from after. It can be large, like the start of a new year, or small, like the beginning of a week, a birthday, or even the first day after returning from a trip. What matters is not the size of the change, but the perception of separation. When the brain recognizes a temporal landmark, it automatically reorganizes experience around it. Events that happen before the landmark are grouped together. Events that happen after are treated as belonging to a new segment. This happens without conscious effort. The brain does not ask whether the boundary is logical or useful. It responds simply to the presence of a marker. January 1st is one of the clearest temporal landmarks humans experience. It arrives predictably. It is shared by millions of people at the same time, and it carries cultural meaning that reinforces its importance. Because of this, the brain treats it as a strong dividing line. What came before feels contained. What comes after feels open. Research in behavioral science shows that people experience increased motivation and optimism around temporal landmarks. Not because their abilities suddenly change, but because their self-perception does. The past self and the current self begin to feel distinct. This distinction matters. When experiences feel too continuous, mistakes feel permanent. Habits feel fixed. Patterns feel difficult to interrupt. But when a boundary appears, the brain gains distance from its own history. Distance reduces emotional weight. Thoughts like, "I've always struggled with this," soften into, "This was something I struggled with before." The wording may seem subtle, but the effect is measurable. Psychological distance allows reflection without threat. Temporal landmarks make this distance easier to access. They act like pauses in a long sentence. The meaning remains, but the breath changes. One of the most interesting findings in temporal landmark research is that the effect does not depend on whether the person believes in the landmark intellectually. Even people who claim they do not care about the new year still show changes in behavior and self-evaluation around it. The brain responds whether or not the belief is endorsed. This suggests that temporal landmarks operate at a perceptual level, not a motivational one. They change how time is felt. When time feels segmented, the future feels less crowded. The brain does not need to compete with past experiences for attention. Instead, it can simulate possibilities more freely. This is why ideas about change often feel lighter at the start of a new year. The content of the idea has not improved. The mental environment around it has. Temporal landmarks also influence how goals are evaluated. When a goal is considered within an old time segment, it is weighed against everything that already happened. Past failures, missed opportunities, and unfinished efforts all contribute to the emotional tone. But when that same goal is considered within a new segment, it stands alone. The brain evaluates it more neutrally. This neutrality is not excitement, it is openness. Openness requires less energy than resistance. It allows curiosity to exist where judgment once lived. And curiosity is a more sustainable state than motivation. From a neurological perspective, this shift is associated with reduced activity in areas of the brain involved in threat and self-criticism, and increased engagement of regions involved in planning and abstract thinking. The brain is not demanding action. It is exploring. Temporal landmarks also affect memory encoding. Experiences that occur near a boundary are often remembered more clearly. The brain treats them as significant, even if they are ordinary. This is why the first days of a year often feel sharper in memory than the days that follow. Clarity gives the illusion of importance, and importance invites intention. When someone sets a New Year's resolution, the brain is not committing to a contract. It is responding to a moment that feels marked, distinct, and meaningful. The intention arises naturally within that context. Importantly, the brain does not require certainty for this process to occur. It does not need a detailed plan. It does not need confidence in success. It only needs a boundary. The presence of a temporal landmark gives the brain permission to reconsider itself, to imagine alternatives without immediately dismissing them, to hold the idea of change without pressure. This permission is quiet, but powerful. It explains why resolutions often feel sincere even when they are not fully formed. The brain is responding to timing, not outcome. Temporal landmarks do not guarantee change. They create conditions where change feels possible. And possibility, in itself, is a meaningful psychological state. As the year begins, this subtle shift continues beneath awareness. Time feels reorganized. Memory feels settled. The future feels slightly less defined. And in that undefined space, intention naturally appears. When a temporal landmark appears, something subtle begins to shift. The brain does not register it as an instruction to change. It registers it as an opportunity to reset context. The same thoughts exist, the same habits remain nearby, but they are no longer pressed up against the present moment. This shift is known in psychology as the fresh start effect. The fresh start effect describes how perceived beginnings temporarily change how people evaluate themselves, their past, and their future. It is not a surge of willpower. It is a reframing of identity across time. Before the boundary, actions feel attached to history. After the boundary, actions feel less burdened by it. The brain begins to separate who someone was from who they are becoming. This separation is not dramatic. It is quiet and cognitive. The past self becomes a reference point rather than a weight. Mistakes feel less defining. Patterns feel less permanent. From a neurological standpoint, this matters because the brain responds differently to threats than it does to possibilities. When a goal feels like a correction of past failure, the brain often engages protective systems. Self-criticism increases. Avoidance becomes more likely. Effort feels heavy. But when that same goal feels like an exploration within a new context, the brain remains more regulated. Planning systems activate without triggering threat responses. Curiosity replaces urgency. This is why the same resolution can feel exhausting in late December and strangely light on January 1st. Nothing about the goal has changed. The framing has. Research shows that during fresh start moments, people are more willing to pursue goals aligned with long-term values rather than short-term comfort. This does not mean they act immediately. It means they are more open to imagining consistency over time. Imagination precedes action. The brain must first be able to picture a future self before it can support behaviors that lead there. Temporal landmarks help with this by creating distance from the present identity. Distance creates flexibility. Importantly, the fresh start effect does not erase the past. Memory remains intact. Habits still exist. The brain is not pretending that nothing came before. Instead, it reassigns meaning. Past experiences are stored as information rather than evidence. They become data points rather than definitions. This allows learning without emotional overload. From the perspective of the nervous system, this is stabilizing. When the past feels closed, vigilance decreases. The brain no longer scans for unresolved issues with the same intensity. Attention can shift outward instead of looping inward. This shift is often experienced subjectively as relief. Not relief that everything is fixed, but relief that everything does not need to be fixed all at once. The fresh start effect also influences motivation in a specific way. Rather than increasing intensity, it increases willingness. Willingness is quieter than motivation. It does not push. It does not rush. It simply allows engagement to begin without resistance. This is why resolutions often start gently. A thought rather than a plan. An idea rather than a schedule. The brain is testing orientation, not demanding execution. The effect is temporary, but its influence can extend beyond the initial moment. Even after the sense of novelty fades, the cognitive reorganization remains. The brain has already updated its internal timeline. The year now exists as a new container. Experiences begin to accumulate within it. This accumulation matters. Once a few actions occur within the new frame, they are stored differently than actions associated with the past. They feel more representative of the current self, even if they are small. A single decision made early in the year can feel more meaningful than the same decision made later, not because it is more important, but because it belongs to the beginning. Beginnings carry symbolic weight. Symbols affect perception, and perception shapes behavior. The fresh start effect does not promise transformation. It does not ensure follow-through, but it provides a moment where the brain is more receptive to alignment between intention and identity. That receptivity is the real benefit. It creates a brief window where change feels less threatening and more imaginable, where effort feels less corrective and more exploratory. And even when that window closes, the brain remembers that it opened. That memory alone can influence what comes next. When a resolution forms, it often arrives quietly, not as a plan, not as a schedule, but as a sentence that begins with "this year." That sentence does something subtle to the brain. It creates structure. From a biological perspective, uncertainty is effortful. When the brain cannot detect direction, it remains alert. Attention stays diffused. Thoughts circle without landing. This state is not always stressful, but it requires energy to maintain. Direction reduces that load. Even loose direction. When a person names an intention, the brain no longer treats the future as completely unshaped. It gains a reference point, not a destination, but an orientation. Orientation is stabilizing. Neuroscience shows that the brain is constantly predicting what comes next. It prefers environments where those predictions have some coherence. When time feels unstructured, prediction becomes harder, and the nervous system compensates by staying more vigilant. A simple intention lowers that vigilance. The brain does not need the intention to be realistic, detailed, or even likely. It only needs a sense that something is being held in mind. This allows background processes to quiet slightly. In this way, a resolution functions less like a command and more like a framework. Frameworks do not force behavior, they hold it. This is why many people report feeling calmer after deciding on a resolution, even before doing anything about it. The act of deciding reduces internal noise. Competing thoughts no longer need to fight for priority. The future has been lightly organized. This effect is especially noticeable when intentions align with values rather than outcomes. "I want to be healthier" creates a broader structure than "I must lose a certain amount of weight." The first offers direction. The second demands precision. The brain responds better to direction. Precision increases pressure. Direction increases coherence. From a regulatory standpoint, coherence allows the nervous system to downshift. When the brain senses that effort will unfold over time rather than all at once, stress responses soften. This does not mean effort disappears. It means effort becomes distributed. Distributed effort is easier to sustain. Another quiet benefit of intention is that it narrows attention gently, not by exclusion, but by relevance. When an intention exists, certain choices begin to feel more connected to something larger. The brain is skilled at detecting relevance. Once relevance is established, decision-making requires less deliberation. Choices do not need to be evaluated from scratch. They are referenced against a simple internal guideline. This reduces decision fatigue. Decision fatigue is one of the most overlooked sources of exhaustion. When every choice feels isolated, the brain must repeatedly engage evaluative systems. When choices are contextualized by intention, evaluation becomes faster and less effortful. The decision does not feel easier because it is obvious. It feels easier because it belongs somewhere. Importantly, intention does not require consistency to be effective. Even when behavior fluctuates, the structure remains available. The brain does not erase orientation after a missed opportunity. Orientation is resilient. This is why people often return to resolutions weeks or months later without consciously deciding to do so. The intention has remained active in the background, even when attention drifted elsewhere. From a systems perspective, this background presence matters more than short-term adherence. It allows the brain to re-engage without needing a new justification each time. Structure also influences how setbacks are interpreted. When an intention exists, deviations are seen as pauses rather than endings. The brain does not immediately categorize them as failure. Without structure, a single deviation can feel like collapse. With structure, it feels like interruption. Interruption is recoverable. Collapse feels final. This distinction changes emotional response. It reduces shame. It preserves agency. And it keeps the nervous system from escalating unnecessarily. Intention does not demand performance. It offers containment. Containment is one of the brain's preferred conditions. It allows exploration within boundaries rather than chaos without edges. Even flexible boundaries are enough. The resolution, at its best, is not a rule. It is a shape, a simple outline the brain can return to when attention wanders, a reference point that remains available without insisting. And in a system that constantly seeks order without rigidity, that shape is often enough to bring quiet stability to the year ahead. Once an intention exists, something else begins to happen quietly in the background. The brain starts to simulate. This does not look like detailed planning or rigid forecasting. It is softer than that, more like brief flashes of possibility. Small imagined moments, passing thoughts about how a future version of life might feel. Neuroscientists refer to this as future simulation. The human brain has the ability to project itself forward in time. It can imagine scenarios, test outcomes, and rehearse actions without physically performing them. This capacity evolved not to guarantee success, but to reduce uncertainty. Uncertainty is costly. When the brain cannot anticipate what lies ahead, it compensates by increasing alertness. Thoughts remain active. Attention stays scattered. Rest becomes harder to access. Simulation eases that tension. When someone sets a resolution, the brain begins lightly rehearsing what that change could look like. Not continuously, not consciously, but often enough to provide a sense of familiarity with the idea. Familiarity reduces threat. A future that has been imagined feels less foreign. Even if the details are vague, the brain no longer treats it as entirely unknown. This allows regulation systems to remain engaged rather than defensive. Importantly, this rehearsal does not require commitment. The brain is not locking in a plan. It is simply exploring, seeing what fits, testing emotional responses, noticing which possibilities feel aligned and which feel strained. This is why planning can feel soothing when it remains flexible. Rigid planning demands certainty. Gentle simulation invites curiosity. From a neurological perspective, simulation activates regions of the brain involved in abstract thinking, memory integration, and long-term orientation. These systems are associated with calm focus rather than urgency. When simulation remains open-ended, it does not trigger stress responses. It creates a sense of preparedness without pressure. This is one reason people often enjoy imagining new routines more than executing them. The imagination stage is regulated. The execution stage involves friction, but the imagination stage still matters. By rehearsing change mentally, the brain lowers the activation threshold required to act later. Actions feel less abrupt when they have been pictured before. The nervous system recognizes them as familiar patterns rather than sudden disruptions. This recognition is subtle, but it accumulates. A person who has imagined themselves reading more has already placed that behavior into their internal map of the future. When the opportunity arises, it does not feel completely new. It feels like something already considered. This reduces resistance. Simulation also helps the brain detect feasibility. Some imagined futures feel expansive, others feel tight. The brain registers these sensations and adjusts expectations accordingly. This adjustment happens without conscious analysis. It explains why some resolutions evolve over time. The brain is refining the simulation based on emotional feedback. It is learning what fits the system and what does not. This learning is not failure. It is calibration. Calibration allows intentions to become more realistic without becoming smaller. The shape of the goal changes, but the direction remains. Another quiet benefit of simulation is that it gives the brain something to return to during moments of pause. Idle moments are rarely empty. The brain fills them with thought. When no orientation exists, idle thought often drifts backward. Reflection turns into rumination. Attention loops around what has already happened. When an intention exists, idle thought has somewhere else to go. It drifts forward. This forward drift is gentler than worry and less activating than excitement. It occupies attention just enough to prevent looping without demanding action. Over time, this pattern changes how the brain experiences waiting, resting, and transition moments. The future becomes present without becoming urgent. Planning, in this sense, is not about efficiency. It is about familiarity. By the time action eventually occurs, the brain has already visited the idea many times. The nervous system recognizes the terrain. The effort feels less abrupt, less disruptive. And even when action does not follow immediately, the simulation itself has already served a purpose. It has softened the future, reduced uncertainty, and given the brain a place to rest its attention. In a system designed to predict and prepare, that quiet rehearsal is not wasted. It is part of how change begins. As the brain begins to imagine what lies ahead, another state often emerges alongside it. Hope. Hope is commonly described as a feeling, but in the brain, it functions more like a cognitive pattern. It involves the ability to picture a future that is different from the present, and to believe, at least quietly, that movement toward it is possible. This belief does not need certainty. It only needs openness. From a neurological perspective, hope is linked to future-oriented thinking and goal representation. When the brain engages these systems, it shifts away from survival-focused monitoring and toward long-range integration. This shift alone changes how the body feels. Stress responses soften. Attention becomes less reactive. Thoughts slow slightly. Hope does not excite the nervous system. It steadies it. Research has shown that hopeful thinking is associated with lower baseline stress levels and improved emotional regulation. This is not because circumstances immediately improve. but because perception does. When the brain believes that forward movement exists, even loosely, it no longer needs to remain on high alert. Vigilance decreases. The system can afford to wait. New Year's resolutions often generate this effect unintentionally. The resolution itself does not create hope. The orientation it provides allows hope to surface. When a person thinks, "This year, I want to take better care of myself," the brain is not evaluating logistics. It is registering the possibility of alignment. That possibility alters internal tone. Importantly, hope in this context is not fragile. It does not collapse the moment a plan is missed or delayed. Because it is not tied to immediate success, it persists as a background state. It can dim, but it does not disappear. This persistence is one of hope's most useful features. Unlike motivation, which fluctuates rapidly, hope changes slowly. It provides emotional continuity even when behavior is inconsistent. The brain remains oriented toward possibility rather than closure. This is why people often return to the same resolutions year after year. It is not stubbornness. It is hope renewing itself within familiar structures. From a biological standpoint, this repetition is adaptive. The brain favors systems that allow for re-engagement without penalty. Hope offers exactly that. Another subtle aspect of hope is that it expands temporal perspective. When hope is present, the future is not compressed into the immediate moment. The brain can tolerate delay. It does not demand instant results. Tolerance of delay is a marker of regulation. When delay feels safe, urgency decreases. When urgency decreases, choices become more flexible. The system no longer needs to act out of pressure. This makes long-term change more viable. Hope also influences how effort is perceived. Effort attached to hope feels lighter than effort attached to correction. The same action can feel restorative or draining depending on the narrative it belongs to. Within a hopeful frame, effort feels like participation. Within a corrective frame, effort feels like punishment. New Year's resolutions, at their best, place effort within the former. They suggest movement towards something, rather than escape from something else. This distinction matters deeply to the nervous system. Avoidance-driven behavior often triggers stress responses. Approach-oriented behavior is more likely to engage calm focus. Hope shifts behavior from avoidance to approach without requiring conscious reframing. It happens automatically when the future feels open. Hope also alters memory. When people feel hopeful, they recall past experiences differently. The brain places less emphasis on failure and more on learning. Memories lose some of their emotional charge. They become informational rather than defining. This reorganization allows the past to exist without dominating the present. And that, too, is stabilizing. In the context of New Year's resolutions, hope is not an outcome. It is a condition that arises when the brain senses orientation, distance from the past, and permission to imagine. Even if the resolution itself changes, fades, or evolves, the hopeful state it briefly creates can leave a lasting imprint. It teaches the nervous system that forward-looking calm is possible. And once that possibility is experienced, the brain remembers it. That memory becomes part of what carries the year forward. After hope settles into the background, another shift often follows. Motivation appears, not as urgency, not as intensity, but as a quiet willingness to engage. Motivation is often misunderstood as a force that pushes behavior forward. In reality, the brain experiences motivation more like an opening, a reduced resistance to starting, a soft readiness rather than a surge of energy. This distinction matters. Pressure-based motivation relies on threat. It is driven by fear of falling behind, fear of failing, or fear of remaining the same. While this kind of motivation can produce short bursts of action, it keeps the nervous system activated. Effort feels tense. Attention narrows. Fatigue arrives quickly. Voluntary motivation feels different. When a New Year's resolution is chosen rather than imposed, the brain categorizes it as self-directed. Autonomy is preserved. This activates neural systems associated with agency and internal reward rather than stress. The body responds accordingly. Heart rate variability improves. Muscle tension decreases. Cognitive flexibility increases. Motivation that arises from choice does not demand immediate execution. It simply lowers the threshold for action. Starting feels possible rather than forced. This is why resolutions that are framed gently often last longer than those framed rigidly. The brain resists coercion, even when it comes from within, but it responds well to invitation. Invitation does not activate defense. In the early days of a resolution, motivation often feels present without being urgent. There is interest rather than insistence, curiosity rather than discipline. This state is neurologically efficient. Effort does not spike. Energy does not crash. Attention remains balanced. From a scientific perspective, this kind of motivation is associated with dopamine functioning in a steady, anticipatory way, rather than in sharp peaks. Dopamine is not only about pleasure. It is about relevance and expectation. When something feels meaningful but not pressured, dopamine signaling remains stable. This supports persistence over time rather than short-lived bursts. Another benefit of low-pressure motivation is that it allows rest to coexist with intention. When motivation is tied to pressure, rest feels like failure. When motivation is voluntary, rest feels compatible with progress. The nervous system does not interpret pauses as threats. This compatibility is crucial. Systems that cannot tolerate rest eventually exhaust themselves. Systems that integrate rest remain adaptive. New Year's resolutions, when approached without pressure, create a unique motivational environment. They exist at the intersection of hope and choice. The future feels open, and engagement feels optional. Optional engagement is powerful. When the brain believes it can disengage at any time, it paradoxically becomes more willing to stay engaged. Safety increases persistence. This is why people often return to resolutions even after stepping away. The motivation was never framed as all or nothing. The door remains open. Motivation also becomes more flexible under low pressure. It adapts to context rather than demanding uniform output. Some days invite more effort, others invite less. The system adjusts without collapsing. This flexibility prevents the internal conflict that often derails behavior change. Conflict arises when expectations exceed capacity. Low-pressure motivation keeps expectations aligned with current resources. Another subtle effect is emotional neutrality. When motivation is gentle, actions are not loaded with meaning. A single choice does not represent success or failure. It is simply one moment among many. This neutrality reduces emotional volatility. Behavior becomes easier to repeat when it is not emotionally charged. The brain prefers patterns that do not require constant emotional regulation. In this way, motivation without pressure supports habit formation indirectly. It does not force repetition. It allows repetition to emerge naturally. New Year's resolutions are often criticized for fading motivation, but what actually fades is pressure-based energy. Voluntary motivation often remains, quieter and less noticeable. It does not announce itself. It does not insist. It waits. And when conditions are right, it reappears without effort. This is one of the least visible benefits of setting an intention. It reshapes motivation from something that must be summoned into something that is available. Not constantly, not predictably, but gently. And for a nervous system designed to conserve energy while adapting over time, that gentle availability is often exactly what allows change to continue. In the early days of a new year, motivation often feels unusually present, not overwhelming, not urgent, but noticeable. People feel slightly more willing to act, slightly more open to starting, slightly more interested in aligning their days with intention. This early lift is often misunderstood as something fragile, something destined to disappear. But from a scientific perspective, it is expected. When a new temporal segment begins, the brain enters a phase of heightened relevance detection. New periods of time signal that information may matter more than usual. Attention widens, curiosity increases. The system prepares to learn. This preparation is reflected in how motivation rises. Rather than pushing behavior forward, the brain is scanning for opportunities to express the new orientation it has just formed. It is asking, quietly, what belongs in this new space? That question itself creates momentum. Neurochemically, this early motivation is linked to anticipation rather than reward. Dopamine activity increases not because something has been achieved, but because something feels possible. The future holds shape, but not detail. This kind of motivation feels light. It does not require proof. It does not demand results. It simply invites engagement. As time passes, this anticipatory state naturally settles. The brain cannot remain in heightened novelty detection indefinitely. Novelty fades, routine returns, attention narrows again. This shift is often labeled as losing motivation, but that framing is incomplete. What is actually fading is novelty-driven energy. Novelty is resource-intensive. It temporarily elevates alertness and exploration, but it is not meant to last. The nervous system gradually returns to baseline, conserving energy for sustained functioning. This return is not failure. It is regulation. When novelty fades, motivation does not disappear entirely. It changes form. Early motivation is broad and exploratory. Later motivation becomes selective. The brain begins filtering. some intentions remain relevant. Others quietly dissolve. This filtering is adaptive. The brain is not abandoning goals at random. It is assessing fit. It is noticing which intentions integrate smoothly into daily life and which require constant friction. High-friction goals demand ongoing novelty to survive. Low-friction goals survive without it. This is why some resolutions persist quietly, while others fade without drama. The brain is choosing efficiency. Importantly, the early motivational peak serves a purpose even when behavior does not follow immediately. It allows the brain to sample possibilities, to test emotional responses, to notice which ideas feel expansive and which feel constricting. Sampling is information. Without that early lift, many possibilities would never be considered at all. The brain would remain anchored to the familiar, even if the familiar no longer fits. Early motivation opens the door. What walks through that door is refined over time. Another reason early motivation feels strong is that it is unburdened by feedback. At the beginning, there are no data points, no outcomes to evaluate, no progress to measure. The absence of feedback keeps motivation pure. Once feedback appears, interpretation begins. The brain starts adjusting expectations. Effort becomes contextual rather than idealized. This adjustment often feels like loss, but it is actually precision. Motivation becomes grounded. Grounded motivation is quieter. It does not announce itself. It operates in smaller increments, but it is more sustainable. It aligns effort with capacity rather than aspiration. New Year's resolutions often fail not because motivation disappears, but because people expect the early state to persist. When it fades, they assume something has gone wrong. In reality, the system is functioning as designed. Early motivation introduces change. Later motivation decides whether it stays. Both phases are necessary. The early peak creates openness. The later settling creates integration. Understanding this reframes the entire experience. Motivation is no longer something to chase or preserve. It is something to notice, use, and allow to change. The early days of the year are not meant to carry the whole journey. They are meant to begin it. And once that beginning has served its purpose, the brain naturally shifts into a steadier, quieter mode of engagement, one that can last far longer than novelty ever could. As the year continues, attention often shifts. People begin to ask whether they are still following their resolutions, whether they are doing enough, whether the intention they set at the beginning of the year still counts. This is usually the point where the idea of failure enters the conversation. But the concept of failure, as it relates to New Year's resolutions, is largely a misunderstanding of how the brain actually works. From a biological perspective, change is rarely binary. The brain does not operate on success or failure switches. It operates on gradients. Adjustments, probabilities that shift over time. When a resolution is framed as something that must be completed perfectly, the brain interprets deviation as threat. Threat activates protective responses. Attention narrows. Self-criticism increases. Engagement decreases. This reaction has little to do with the resolution itself. It has to do with interpretation. Most resolutions do not fail. They simply stop being evaluated consciously. The intention moves from the foreground into the background, where it continues to influence behavior in subtler ways. This influence is often overlooked because it is not dramatic. A person who intended to eat better may not follow a strict plan, but they may notice food choices more often. A person who planned to read more may not finish many books, but they may spend more time with written material than before. A person who wanted to exercise regularly may not keep a schedule, but they may move their body more frequently than they did last year. These changes do not register as success because they are not measured against the original ideal, but biologically, they still matter. The brain learns through exposure and repetition, not declarations. Each moment of alignment, however small, reinforces neural pathways associated with that behavior. The system does not require consistency to update. It only requires occurrence. This is why partial follow-through still produces change. When behavior occurs even intermittently, the brain records it as possible. Possibility is a powerful signal. It expands the range of future actions the brain is willing to consider. Failure, in contrast, suggests closure. But most resolutions never truly close. They remain open loops. Open loops are uncomfortable to evaluate, but they are rich with information. They tell the brain what was attempted, what felt natural, and what created resistance. This information accumulates over years, often without conscious tracking. Over time, the brain becomes more accurate in its self-assessment. This accuracy is not pessimism, it is realism. Realism supports better alignment between intention and capacity. It reduces the need for dramatic goals and increases the likelihood of sustainable ones. Another reason the idea of failure is misleading is that it assumes resolutions exist only to produce outcomes. In reality, resolutions also serve a regulatory function. They organize attention. They reduce uncertainty. They provide orientation. These effects occur regardless of outcome. Even a resolution that is never acted upon has already changed how the brain experienced the beginning of the year. It created structure. It generated hope. It allowed simulation. It shaped motivation. Those effects do not disappear simply because behavior does not match the initial plan. They have already occurred. From this perspective, the question of failure becomes less relevant. The brain is not asking whether the resolution was completed. It is updating based on exposure, feedback, and meaning. It is refining its understanding of what fits and what does not. This refinement is ongoing. Labeling this process as failure interrupts learning. It collapses nuance into judgment. The nervous system responds by disengaging. Learning requires openness. Judgment closes the loop prematurely. This is why people who view resolutions as experiments tend to benefit more than those who view them as tests. Experiments allow adjustment. Tests demand performance. The brain prefers experiments. It is designed to sample, adjust, and repeat. When a resolution is approached as an experiment, deviations become data. The system remains curious rather than defensive. Engagement can resume without shame. This stance preserves self-trust. Self-trust is not built by perfect follow-through. It is built by the ability to return without punishment. In this light, most New Year's resolutions do not fail. They simply change shape. They soften. They adapt. They integrate quietly into the background of daily life. And in doing so, they continue to influence behavior in ways that are difficult to measure, but easy for the brain to use. What looks like failure from the outside is often just the brain doing what it does best, learning over time. Once the idea of failure loosens its hold, something else becomes easier to notice. Change does not depend on completion. The brain does not require goals to be finished in order to benefit from them. What it responds to most strongly is orientation, a sense of direction, a quiet understanding of what matters, even when action is inconsistent. Orientation gives the nervous system a reference point. Without it, attention scatters. Decisions feel isolated. Each moment must be evaluated on its own, without context. This is cognitively demanding. With orientation, moments connect. They belong to something larger than themselves. A choice does not need to be perfect to be meaningful. It only needs to align, even briefly, with an existing direction. From a neurological perspective, orientation simplifies processing. When the brain knows what it is oriented toward, it can evaluate relevance more efficiently. This reduces the effort required to decide, act, and reflect. Completion, by contrast, is absolute. It assumes an endpoint, a finish line, a moment where effort either succeeded or did not. The brain does not naturally operate this way. Most biological systems are continuous, adaptive, and ongoing. They adjust rather than conclude. This is why completion-based thinking often creates tension. It places pressure on the system to resolve something that was never meant to be resolved all at once. Orientation removes that pressure. When a resolution is treated as orientation rather than obligation, it becomes something the brain can carry lightly. It does not demand constant attention. It does not collapse after interruption. It remains available. Availability matters more than intensity. A direction that is always available allows the brain to re-engage when conditions are right. Fatigue, distraction, and competing priorities no longer signal failure. They signal timing. Timing is negotiable. Orientation also changes how progress is perceived. Instead of tracking outcomes, the brain begins to notice alignment. Small moments where behavior reflects intention, even if briefly. These moments register as coherence. Coherence is calming. When the brain detects coherence between intention and action, it experiences less internal conflict. Conflict requires regulation. Coherence reduces the need for it. This reduction in conflict often goes unnoticed, but it accumulates. Over time, fewer mental resources are spent managing contradiction. Attention becomes more available. The system feels less fragmented. Orientation also supports identity continuity. Rather than framing change as becoming someone else, orientation allows the current self to evolve gradually. The brain does not need to abandon its history. It simply adjusts trajectory. Trajectories are flexible. They allow course correction without erasure. They account for obstacles without assigning blame. They accept variation without losing direction. This is why many people feel quietly changed by resolutions they never completed. The direction they set influenced how they saw themselves across the year. Identity shifts rarely announce themselves. They emerge through repetition and reflection, not declarations. Another benefit of orientation is that it preserves curiosity. When completion is the goal, curiosity fades quickly. The brain focuses on outcomes. When orientation is the focus, curiosity remains active. The system continues to explore what fits, what feels natural, and what sustains energy. Curiosity keeps engagement alive without force. It allows change to remain interesting rather than exhausting. New Year's resolutions are often framed as challenges to be conquered, but biologically, they function better as compasses. A compass does not tell you how fast to move. It does not demand a straight line. It simply points. And when the brain has something to point toward, it organizes itself accordingly. Even when movement pauses, even when attention drifts, even when life becomes crowded, the orientation remains. In the long view, this is where the real benefit of resolutions lives. Not in completion, but in quiet alignment. Not in outcomes, but in direction. The brain does not need to arrive. It only needs to know where it is facing. When orientation is present, attention begins to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, in the background. The brain is constantly filtering information. At any given moment, far more sensory input exists than the nervous system can process. To manage this, the brain prioritizes what feels relevant and lets the rest fade into the background. Orientation influences this filtering. When a person holds an intention, the brain subtly adjusts what it notices. Certain details stand out more often. Others pass by without registering. This shift does not require effort. It happens automatically, guided by relevance rather than instruction. Neuroscience refers to this process as selective attention. Selective attention is not about focus in the traditional sense. It is not concentration or discipline. It is a background system that decides what enters awareness and what does not. Once an intention exists, that system updates its criteria. For example, someone who intends to move more may begin noticing opportunities for movement that previously went unseen. Stairs instead of elevators, short walks between tasks, moments of restlessness that invite motion rather than distraction. Nothing has changed externally. What has changed is what the brain flags as meaningful. This effect extends beyond behavior. It also applies to information. Articles, conversations, and observations related to the intention begin to feel more noticeable. The brain tags them as relevant to the current orientation. This tagging reduces effort. When something is perceived as relevant, it requires less energy to engage with. Attention flows toward it naturally. Curiosity replaces force. Importantly, this shift does not demand action. Noticing is enough. The brain learns through exposure before it learns through repetition. Each time something related to the intention enters awareness, the brain updates its internal map. Connections strengthen quietly, even without conscious follow-through. This is one reason change often feels invisible while it is happening. The brain is adjusting priorities long before behavior stabilizes. Another subtle effect of attention shifting is that friction becomes more apparent. When an intention exists, obstacles stand out more clearly. Certain environments feel misaligned. Certain routines feel heavier than before. This awareness is not negative. It is informative. The brain is identifying where energy is lost and where it is preserved. This information shapes future choices without requiring immediate correction. Over time, attention begins to gravitate toward conditions that support the orientation and away from those that resist it. This gravitation is gradual. It does not require resolve. It follows comfort and coherence. This process explains why people sometimes find themselves changing habits without remembering when they decided to do so. The decision was not made in a single moment. It emerged from repeated attentional shifts. Attention creates familiarity. Familiarity reduces resistance. Resistance fading allows behavior to change with less effort. From a regulatory perspective, this is efficient. The nervous system prefers adjustments that occur through perception rather than force. Force demands energy. Perception redirects it. Attention also influences emotional tone. When orientation guides attention, moments of alignment feel subtly rewarding. Not euphoric, not dramatic, simply right. These small signals reinforce direction without demanding repetition. The brain registers them as coherence. Coherence stabilizes mood. At the same time, moments that feel misaligned may carry a slight sense of discomfort. Not guilt, not failure, just a recognition that something does not fit as well as it once did. This discomfort is often mistaken for loss of motivation. In reality, it is refinement. The brain is becoming more precise in its preferences. This refinement does not require conscious awareness to function. It unfolds through everyday experience, through noticing, through contrast. Over weeks and months, these attentional shifts accumulate. The environment begins to feel different. Not because it has changed, but because the brain is interacting with it differently. Certain choices feel easier to make. Certain patterns feel less appealing. Certain directions feel more obvious. This is not because the resolution is being actively enforced. It is because orientation has reshaped attention. Attention, more than effort, determines what becomes habitual. What is seen repeatedly becomes familiar. What becomes familiar becomes easier to approach. What is approached repeatedly begins to integrate. This integration happens slowly enough to feel natural. And because it is natural, it lasts longer. New Year's resolutions are often judged by visible action alone. But beneath action lies attention. And beneath attention lies orientation. As attention shifts, change begins to express itself in smaller ways. Not through dramatic actions, not through decisive moments, but through ordinary decisions that barely register as decisions at all. The brain is not designed to change through sudden transformation. It adapts through accumulation, through repeated exposure to slightly different choices made over time. This is why long timelines matter. When a resolution exists as orientation rather than obligation, the brain no longer looks for a single moment where everything changes. Instead, it allows influence to unfold gradually, through patterns that form quietly. A small decision rarely feels important in isolation. choosing one option over another, stopping slightly earlier, beginning slightly later, pausing instead of pushing. These moments are easy to dismiss because they do not feel like progress. They do not announce themselves. But biologically, they are the primary mechanism through which behavior shifts. Each small decision updates probability. The brain learns by tracking likelihoods rather than outcomes. When a certain type of choice occurs more often than before, even inconsistently, the brain begins to treat it as more available. Availability changes expectation. Once a behavior feels available, the nervous system no longer resists it as strongly. Effort decreases. Familiarity increases. The choice feels less disruptive. This is why consistency is often misunderstood. Consistency does not mean repetition without interruption. It means recurrence across time. A behavior that appears occasionally, then slightly more often, then naturally returns after absence, is still shaping the system. The brain does not reset progress after pauses. It integrates across them. Long timelines allow this integration to occur without pressure. When time feels expansive, there is room for fluctuation. The nervous system does not need to defend against urgency. Urgency compresses time. Compression increases stress. Stress disrupts learning. When the timeline is long, the system remains open. Another benefit of long timelines is that they protect motivation. When change is expected to happen quickly, every small decision carries weight. Each choice feels symbolic. This symbolism increases emotional load and leads to fatigue. When change is expected to unfold slowly, decisions lose their emotional charge. They become functional rather than evaluative. This neutrality supports repetition. The brain prefers patterns that do not require constant emotional regulation. When a choice does not trigger judgment, it is easier to repeat. Small decisions made under low emotional load are more likely to recur. Over months, these recurrences create shifts that feel organic. The person does not feel like they are forcing themselves to change. They feel like they are slowly becoming more aligned. Alignment feels sustainable. This is why many people notice change only in retrospect. They look back and realize that certain behaviors have become more common, certain reactions less intense, certain choices easier to make. Nothing dramatic happened. The timeline did the work. Long timelines also allow the brain to adapt contextually. Behavior is influenced by environment, energy levels, social dynamics, and stress. A system that expects immediate consistency ignores these variables. A system that allows time accounts for them. Accounting for variability reduces internal conflict. The brain does not need to reconcile intention with capacity in every moment. It trusts that alignment will return when conditions allow. This trust is stabilizing. Small decisions accumulate not because they are tracked, but because they are tolerated. The brain does not abandon direction after deviation. It simply resumes influence when attention aligns again. This is why change that happens over long timelines feels less effortful. Effort is spread thin enough to be unnoticed. New Year's resolutions are often judged too early. They are evaluated on short-term performance rather than long-term drift. But the brain measures change differently. It measures trend, not streak. A trend does not require perfection. It requires movement across time. Even subtle movement is enough to update the system. When orientation exists, attention shifts. When attention shifts, small decisions change. When small decisions change, timelines do the rest. This is the quiet architecture of lasting change. Not urgency, not intensity, but patience woven into daily life. And within that patience, the brain does exactly what it was designed to do: adapt. As small decisions accumulate across time, the brain begins to reveal a preference. It prefers flexibility. Rigid systems demand sameness. They expect behavior to look identical across days, moods, and circumstances. Flexibility allows variation. It adapts to energy, context, and change without losing direction. From a biological perspective, flexibility is not weakness. It is efficiency. The nervous system evolved to adjust continuously. It monitors internal states, environmental conditions, and available resources. When behavior adapts to these signals, the system remains regulated. When behavior ignores them, tension builds. Rigid goals often ignore these signals. They ask for consistency without context. They demand output without regard for capacity. Over time, this creates friction between intention and reality. Friction is costly. It requires constant self-regulation. The brain must repeatedly override signals of fatigue, distraction, or stress. This override consumes energy and increases the likelihood of withdrawal. Flexibility reduces this cost. When a resolution is flexible, it can bend without breaking. The brain does not need to defend against deviation. It simply adjusts. Adjustment keeps the system engaged. One of the most common reasons people abandon resolutions is not lack of motivation, but rigidity. When a goal cannot adapt, a single disruption feels catastrophic. The system interprets deviation as collapse. Flexibility reframes deviation as information. Information does not threaten identity. It informs it. From a learning standpoint, flexible goals allow the brain to refine behavior through feedback. Each experience contributes data. What felt manageable? What felt draining? What fit naturally into daily life? This data shapes future choices automatically. The brain is constantly optimizing for sustainability. It notices which behaviors preserve energy and which consume it. Flexible goals align with this process. Rigid goals fight it. Another advantage of flexibility is that it preserves emotional neutrality. Rigid systems attach meaning to every action. A missed day feels like failure. A disrupted routine feels like loss. Emotional weight accumulates quickly. Flexible systems keep actions light. A missed opportunity becomes a pause. A disrupted routine becomes a temporary adjustment. The brain remains calm enough to continue. Calm supports persistence. Persistence does not require intensity. It requires safety. When the nervous system feels safe, it is more willing to re-engage after interruption. Flexibility provides that safety. It signals that effort is optional, not demanded. That direction remains even when execution varies. That the system will not punish itself for responding to reality. This signal is powerful. It allows the brain to maintain orientation without pressure. It keeps intention alive in the background rather than forcing it into the foreground. Over time, flexible goals often lead to more consistent behavior than rigid ones, not because they push harder, but because they stay accessible. Accessibility matters more than strictness. A goal that can be returned to repeatedly will influence behavior more than a goal that collapses after disruption. Flexibility also supports self-compassion, which further stabilizes the system. When the brain is not anticipating self-criticism, it does not need to avoid the goal to protect itself. Avoidance decreases. Engagement becomes easier. This is why many long-lasting changes feel almost accidental. The person did not force consistency. They allowed variation. The brain integrated the behavior gradually, without threat. New Year's resolutions are often framed as commitments that require discipline. But biologically, they function better as intentions that allow adaptation. Adaptation is not quitting. It is listening. Listening to energy, listening to context, listening to what fits now. The direction does not disappear when behavior changes shape. It remains present, guiding adjustments quietly. In the long run, flexibility keeps the system intact. It allows the year to unfold without constant evaluation. It lets intention coexist with life, rather than compete with it. And when intention and life stop competing, change no longer feels like work. It feels like movement. As flexibility replaces rigidity, another shift often becomes noticeable. The internal voice softens. Self-judgment has a powerful effect on behavior change. When the brain anticipates criticism, it prepares for threat. Muscles tighten. Attention narrows. The nervous system shifts into a defensive state. In that state, learning slows. This is why harsh self-talk, even when intended to motivate, often produces the opposite result. The brain is no longer focused on adaptation. It is focused on protection. Protection interrupts progress. Self-compassion changes this dynamic. From a neurological perspective, self-compassion is not indulgence. It is regulation. When the internal environment feels safe, the brain can remain open to feedback. It can observe behavior without immediately attaching threat or meaning. This openness is essential for change. When a person responds to missed intentions with gentler language, the nervous system does not escalate. There is no surge of stress hormones, no urgent need to disengage. Attention remains available. Availability supports follow-through. Research shows that people who practice self-compassion after setbacks are more likely to return to their goals than those who respond with self-criticism. Not because they care less, but because they remain regulated. Regulation allows re-entry. Discipline, by contrast, often relies on control. It attempts to override internal signals rather than work with them. While discipline can produce short-term compliance, it requires sustained effort to maintain. Effort without regulation leads to exhaustion. Self-compassion reduces the amount of effort required. It does not eliminate responsibility. It removes threat from the equation. Without threat, the brain can assess what happened calmly. It can ask what contributed to the outcome. It can adjust without shame. Shame collapses attention inward. Compassion keeps attention flexible. This flexibility allows the brain to integrate experience rather than reject it. Another quiet benefit of self-compassion is that it preserves identity stability. When behavior does not align with intention, harsh judgment often leads to identity-level conclusions. This means something about who I am. Identity threats activate deep protective responses. Gentler interpretations keep the behavior separate from the self. The brain can evaluate actions without feeling personally at risk. This separation reduces emotional load and keeps engagement possible. In regulated systems, feedback is information. In dysregulated systems, feedback feels like judgment. New Year's resolutions often fail, not because the intention was flawed, but because the internal response to deviation was too severe. The system shut down to protect itself. Self-compassion keeps the system online. It allows learning to continue even when behavior fluctuates. From a physiological standpoint, regulated nervous systems support memory integration, planning, and flexibility. Dysregulated systems prioritize immediate relief over long-term alignment. This is why regulation consistently outperforms discipline over time. Discipline demands output. Regulation supports capacity. Capacity is not fixed. It changes daily. Self-compassion allows the brain to adjust expectations to current capacity without abandoning direction. This adjustment preserves trust in the process. Trust reduces resistance. When the brain trusts that it will not be punished for variation, it remains willing to try again. This willingness is the foundation of persistence. Persistence does not feel dramatic. It feels steady. Self-compassion also influences how the future is imagined. When the internal tone is kind, future simulations feel safer. The brain does not anticipate judgment. It anticipates support. Supportive anticipation increases engagement. This is why people often return to resolutions years later with renewed clarity. The system has learned that exploration is allowed. That effort does not require self-attack. Over time, this learning accumulates. The brain becomes more skilled at change. Not faster, not more intense, but more sustainable. Self-compassion does not lower standards. It lowers friction. And when friction decreases, movement becomes easier. In the context of New Year's resolutions, self-compassion quietly shifts the entire experience. The resolution no longer feels like a test of character. It becomes a conversation, a dialogue between intention and reality. One that continues without urgency, without punishment, and without needing to be resolved. And within that dialogue, regulation does what discipline alone never can. It keeps the system moving forward. Change rarely happens in isolation. Even when resolutions feel personal, they unfold within a social environment. And the beginning of the year carries a unique social quality that subtly alters how change is experienced. January is shared. Across cultures and communities, people pause at the same time. Conversations shift. Expectations soften. There is an unspoken understanding that many are reconsidering routines, priorities, and direction. This shared pause matters. From a neurological perspective, humans are highly attuned to social context. The brain continuously scans for cues about what is acceptable, expected, and safe within a group. When change is socially visible, the brain perceives less risk in engaging with it. Risk decreases, safety increases. This is one reason intentions feel easier to hold in January than at other times of the year. The environment supports reconsideration. There is collective permission to reset. Permission reduces shame. Shame often arises when change feels like deviation from the norm. When routines are questioned in isolation, the brain may interpret that questioning as exposure, as standing out, as potential threat. In January, that threat diminishes. When many people are adjusting their habits, reflecting on the past year, or experimenting with new routines, change becomes normalized. The brain no longer treats it as risky behavior. Normalization is regulating. It allows the nervous system to remain calm while exploring unfamiliar patterns. The system does not need to protect identity or belonging. Change is framed as participation rather than departure. This framing has practical effects. People are more willing to speak openly about intentions, to acknowledge difficulty, to admit uncertainty. These admissions reduce the internal pressure. The brain no longer needs to maintain a polished narrative of consistency. Honesty supports regulation. Another subtle aspect of the social layer is timing. January aligns many people's intentions simultaneously. This synchronization reduces comparison. When everyone is starting something new, there is less emphasis on who is ahead or behind. The focus shifts from performance to process. Process is safer than outcome. This safety allows people to experiment without feeling evaluated. The nervous system remains engaged rather than defensive. Social context also affects memory. Shared transitions are encoded differently than solitary ones. The brain associates them with collective experience rather than individual struggle. This association reduces emotional intensity and increases meaning. Meaning replaces pressure. In addition, social rhythms influence pacing. When change is shared, there is less urgency to resolve it quickly. The brain senses that others are also navigating adjustment. This slows internal timelines. Slower timelines reduce stress. The social environment also provides external cues that reinforce orientation without demanding action. Seasonal messaging, conversations, and shared reflections all remind the brain of intention gently, without confrontation. These reminders are less threatening than internal self-monitoring. They arrive without judgment. Importantly, the social layer does not require active participation to be effective. Even quiet observers benefit. Simply knowing that others are also reflecting and adjusting is enough to shift perception. The brain registers belonging. Belonging stabilizes. When belonging is intact, the system can tolerate uncertainty. It does not rush to resolve discomfort. It allows change to unfold at a natural pace. This is one reason resolutions often feel heavier when revisited later in the year. The social layer fades. Change becomes individualized again. The brain loses some of the ambient support it once had. But the early social context has already done its work. It has reduced shame. It has normalized exploration. It has allowed intention to form in a regulated environment. Those effects persist. Even after the collective focus moves on, the nervous system remembers that change once felt safe. That memory influences future engagement. New Year's resolutions are often discussed as solitary commitments, but biologically, they are supported by a shared moment. A moment where change feels less exposed, less judged, less urgent. And within that moment, the brain finds the safety it needs to begin. As the social intensity of January begins to soften, attention often turns inward. People look back. They consider what worked, what didn't, and what feels unfinished. This reflection is natural. The brain seeks meaning at transitions. It wants to understand how one period of time connects to the next. But reflection can take two very different paths. One path leads to rumination. The other leads to integration. Rumination is repetitive and emotionally charged. It circles the same memories without resolution. The nervous system stays activated. The brain searches for certainty when none exists. Reflection, by contrast, is spacious. It allows memories to surface without immediately attaching judgment. Events are observed rather than relived. The past is considered without being re-entered. This distinction matters deeply for regulation. From a neurological perspective, rumination keeps threat-related systems engaged. The brain treats memory as if it is happening again. Stress responses remain active. Learning slows. Reflection engages different systems. When the brain reflects without emotional activation, it accesses networks involved in meaning-making and abstraction. These systems allow experiences to be summarized rather than replayed. Summarization reduces load. Instead of holding many details, the brain extracts patterns, themes, lessons that are not tied to specific moments. This process creates coherence without requiring emotional intensity. Coherence is calming. New Year's resolutions often invite reflection because they sit at the boundary between past and future. But when reflection is framed as evaluation, it easily becomes self-criticism. Self-criticism collapses reflection into rumination. Gentler reflection keeps the nervous system open. It asks different questions. Not, why did I fail, but what did I notice? Not, what's wrong with me, but what tends to happen? These questions are informational rather than accusatory. Information supports learning. When reflection remains neutral, the brain can process the past without defending against it. Memory becomes a resource rather than a threat. The system stays regulated enough to integrate what it learns. Integration is the goal. Integration does not require resolution. It does not demand closure. It simply allows the past to be stored in a way that supports the present. This is why reflection often feels lighter when it is not rushed. When there is no pressure to extract a conclusion, meaning emerges naturally. Meaning replaces self-criticism. Meaning gives experiences context rather than verdicts. It allows the brain to see how certain patterns developed without assigning blame. This perspective is stabilizing. It reduces the emotional charge of memory. It allows future-oriented thinking to resume without being pulled backward. Another benefit of reflection without rumination is that it preserves curiosity. When the brain is not defending against judgment, it remains interested. It notices nuance. It stays engaged. Curiosity keeps reflection productive. In contrast, rumination exhausts attention. The brain becomes stuck replaying the same material. Learning stops. Emotional fatigue increases. Reflection also benefits from temporal distance. As time passes, emotional intensity naturally decreases. The brain is better able to view past events as completed rather than ongoing. This distance supports regulation. January provides just enough distance from the previous year to allow reflection without full emotional reactivation. The past feels close enough to remember, but far enough to observe. This balance is ideal. It allows the brain to update its understanding of itself without becoming overwhelmed. Lessons are stored. Patterns are recognized. The system adjusts quietly. Importantly, reflection does not need to produce answers to be useful. The brain benefits simply from the act of noticing, from acknowledging what was present and allowing it to settle. Settling is not forgetting. It is placing memory where it belongs. When reflection remains calm, it supports future intention. The brain does not need to repeat the same cycles unconsciously. It has updated its internal map. This update happens without effort. Over time, reflection without rumination becomes a skill. The brain learns that looking back does not require suffering. That meaning can be found without self-attack. This learning changes how future transitions are experienced. They feel less heavy, less evaluative, more open. And within that openness, intention can continue forward, informed by the past, but not bound to it. Not every intention stays active. Some resolutions fade quietly. Others are set aside after a few weeks. Some are remembered only when the year turns again. This is often described as abandonment, but from the brain's perspective, very little is ever truly abandoned. Even unused goals leave traces. When a resolution is imagined, the brain engages networks involved in planning, simulation, and self-evaluation. These networks do not shut off simply because behavior does not follow. They store information. They update expectations. They refine internal models. Learning occurs without effort. From a neurological standpoint, the brain is always tracking patterns across time. It notices which intentions reappear, which environments support change, and which conditions make effort feel heavy. This tracking does not require conscious attention. Over multiple years, the brain begins to recognize themes. Certain goals return again and again. Others disappear completely. This repetition is meaningful. Recurring intentions signal alignment. They suggest that something matters, even if timing, capacity, or context have not yet supported full expression. The brain treats these repeated ideas as relevant, not as mistakes. Each reappearance adds information. The brain learns what the goal represents emotionally. It learns what kind of change is being sought beneath the surface. Often, the surface goal evolves, but the underlying need remains consistent. For example, a resolution to exercise may appear one year, disappear the next, and return later in a different form. The specific behavior shifts, but the desire for regulation, strength, or presence persists. The brain tracks this continuity. Abandoned resolutions also teach the brain about limits. Limits are not failures. They are boundaries. When a goal repeatedly feels unsustainable, the brain registers that information. It learns where energy is lost, where resistance increases, and where the system becomes dysregulated. This learning refines future intentions automatically. Over time, goals become more realistic, not because ambition decreases, but because understanding increases. Understanding reduces friction. Another overlooked benefit of abandoned resolutions is that they expand the brain's sense of possibility. Even imagining a different future once is enough to register it as conceivable. Conceivable matters. A behavior that has been imagined feels more accessible later, even years later. The brain no longer treats it as foreign. It exists in the internal map. This is why people sometimes adopt changes long after first intending to. The resolution did not fail. It waited. Waiting is not inactivity. It is incubation. The brain often needs multiple exposures to an idea before it integrates fully. Each exposure adds familiarity. Familiarity reduces threat. Reduced threat allows engagement. This process unfolds quietly, without pressure. Another important aspect is that abandoned resolutions contribute to self-knowledge. They clarify preferences. They reveal rhythms. They show which forms of change feel supportive and which feel draining. This clarity accumulates slowly. Over time, the brain becomes more accurate in predicting what will and will not fit. This accuracy supports self-trust, even if it goes unnoticed. The idea that learning requires action is incomplete. The brain learns from consideration, reflection, and contrast as well. Resolutions that are never acted upon still provide contrast. They show what was wanted, what was resisted, and what was possible at that moment in time. This information remains available. From a long-term perspective, abandoned resolutions are not detours. They are data points. They contribute to a broader understanding of self across cycles of intention and adjustment. Cycles matter. Humans revisit intentions not because they forget, but because circumstances change. Capacity changes. Context shifts. What once felt unreachable may later feel natural. The brain remembers previous attempts. It brings that memory forward, refined and softened by time. In this way, no resolution is wasted. Each one participates in an ongoing learning process that does not demand completion. It simply accumulates understanding. And understanding, over time, becomes alignment. As learning accumulates over years, something else begins to form beneath awareness. Self-trust. Self-trust is often mistaken for confidence. But in the brain, it functions more like familiarity, a sense of knowing how one tends to respond, what rhythms feel supportive, and what kinds of effort can be sustained. This familiarity does not come from success. It comes from observation. Each time an intention is considered, acted upon, adjusted, or set aside, the brain gathers information about itself. When this information is collected without judgment, it integrates naturally. Patterns begin to appear. Patterns reduce uncertainty. When the brain understands its own tendencies, it no longer needs to monitor them as closely. Vigilance softens. Internal dialogue becomes quieter. That quiet is self-trust. Intention plays a subtle role in this process. When a resolution forms, the brain enters into a form of self-dialogue. It asks what matters, what feels possible, and what direction seems meaningful in this season. This dialogue builds relationship. Even when behavior does not follow immediately, the act of asking signals care. The brain learns that it can turn inward without pressure or threat. Systems that experience internal safety adapt more easily. Self-trust also develops through familiarity with fluctuation. Energy changes. Interest rises and falls. Focus shifts across days and months. When these variations are expected, they stop being alarming. The brain no longer interprets a dip in engagement as failure. It recognizes it as part of a pattern. This recognition prevents unnecessary intervention. Intervention consumes energy. Understanding conserves it. Over time, the brain becomes more accurate in predicting when effort will feel natural and when rest will be needed. This accuracy reduces friction. Friction erodes trust. Self-trust grows when the system experiences return without punishment. Each time an intention is revisited gently, the brain registers that exploration is allowed. Return matters more than consistency. Consistency demands constant output. Return allows rest and renewal. The brain prefers systems that permit return because they preserve capacity. Another aspect of self-trust is calibration. As the brain learns what fits, future intentions become more precise. They are not smaller, but better matched to context. Goals feel less performative and more personal. Personal alignment requires less regulation. The nervous system does not need to defend against goals that reflect its own rhythms. Effort flows more easily when it feels self-directed. Self-trust also reduces comparison. When direction is internal, external benchmarks lose influence. The brain does not need to measure itself against others to feel oriented. Progress becomes relational rather than competitive. This shift stabilizes motivation. Motivation no longer depends on validation. It arises from coherence between intention and lived experience. Self-trust also changes the relationship with uncertainty. When the brain trusts its ability to adapt, uncertainty becomes tolerable. The future does not need to be fully planned. Tolerance reduces anxiety. New Year's resolutions often contribute to self-trust simply by returning. Each year, the brain revisits questions of direction. Each revisit reinforces familiarity. Familiarity builds trust. Over time, this trust shapes identity. The person experiences themselves as someone who can consider change without losing stability. Someone who can pause without panic. Someone who can begin again without self-judgment. This identity is not claimed. It is felt, quietly. Self-trust does not announce itself. It shows up as steadiness, as patience, as the ability to listen inward without urgency. And within that steadiness, intention becomes less about proving something and more about noticing what fits. Noticing what fits now. Noticing what has shifted. Noticing what remains. In that noticing, the brain does what it has always done best. It adapts, and it trusts itself to continue. As self-trust settles in, the idea of change begins to soften. Change no longer feels like becoming someone else. One of the most persistent myths around New Year's resolutions is that they require reinvention, a new personality, a new identity, a clean break from what came before. But the brain does not favor abrupt replacement. It favors continuity. From a biological perspective, Stability is a prerequisite for change. Systems that feel stable are free to explore. Systems that feel threatened focus on preservation. Reinvention threatens continuity. It implies that what exists now is insufficient, that the past must be discarded for the future to begin. This framing activates defense rather than curiosity. Renewal works differently. Renewal builds on what is already present. It adjusts rather than replaces. It allows the current self to evolve without being erased. This distinction matters to the nervous system. When change is framed as renewal, the brain does not need to protect identity. It does not interpret intention as rejection. Instead, it experiences change as refinement. Refinement feels safe. Safety allows engagement. New Year's resolutions often function best when they operate as invitations to renew rather than demands to reinvent. They ask what can be supported, not what must be eliminated. This question shifts internal tone. Instead of scanning for flaws, the brain scans for capacity. It notices what already works and where small adjustments might help. This preserves stability. Stability reduces effort. When the system feels grounded, it does not need to expend energy defending against disruption. Energy becomes available for exploration. Renewal also respects history. The brain does not forget what has been learned. It carries forward experiences, preferences, and patterns. Renewal integrates these elements rather than discarding them. Integration supports coherence. When past and present are allowed to coexist, the brain experiences less internal conflict. There is no need to choose between who one was and who one is becoming. The trajectory simply continues. This continuity is especially important for long-term change. Behavior that aligns with identity is easier to sustain than behavior that contradicts it. Renewal allows identity to stretch without breaking. Another benefit of renewal is reduced urgency. Reinvention often carries a sense of deadline, a feeling that change must happen now or not at all. Renewal unfolds over time. It allows for gradual adjustment, for experimentation without risk, for exploration without commitment. This pace suits the nervous system. When time feels spacious, the brain remains regulated. It does not rush to resolve uncertainty. It allows patterns to emerge naturally. Renewal also changes how setbacks are interpreted. When change is about reinvention, setbacks feel like proof that the new self is not real. When change is about renewal, setbacks feel like pauses within an ongoing process. Pauses are expected. Expectation reduces emotional impact. The brain does not escalate in response to interruption. It remains oriented, trusting that movement will resume when conditions allow. This trust supports persistence without force. Over time, renewal produces change that feels embodied rather than imposed. The person does not feel like they are performing a role. They feel like they are becoming more themselves. This feeling is subtle. It does not announce itself. It is noticed in comfort, in ease, in the absence of internal resistance. New Year's resolutions, when viewed through this lens, are not declarations of a new identity. They are acknowledgements of readiness to support what already exists. They say quietly, "This part of me matters. And when the brain hears that message, it responds with cooperation rather than defense. Change continues not because it must, but because it fits. And fitting, more than force, is what allows renewal to last. As renewal replaces reinvention, the resolution itself begins to change shape. It no longer stands at the center of attention. What once felt clear and deliberate becomes quieter. The intention is still present, but it no longer demands to be named. It fades from the foreground into the background of daily life. This softening is not loss. It is integration. From a neurological perspective, goals that remain constantly active require sustained monitoring. Monitoring consumes cognitive resources. It keeps attention slightly tense, slightly alert. When a resolution softens, that monitoring relaxes. The brain no longer needs to check progress or evaluate alignment in every moment. The intention has already done its organizing work. It has shaped attention, informed choices, and contributed to learning. Now it can rest. Rest does not erase influence. Instead, influence becomes implicit. The brain begins to rely on what it has already integrated. Certain behaviors feel more familiar. Certain choices feel more natural. The system does not need reminders because relevance has already been established. This is how change becomes invisible. When effort is no longer required to remember the goal has become part of the environment the brain expects. It no longer stands out as something separate from daily experience. Separation dissolves. The nervous system prefers this state. It allows regulation to stabilize. There is no internal pressure to perform, no urgency to maintain momentum. Momentum is no longer needed. Another benefit of softening is that it removes emotional charge. Early in the year, intentions can feel symbolic. Each action seems to carry meaning. Each deviation feels noticeable. As the resolution softens, actions lose their symbolism. They become ordinary. Ordinary actions are easier to repeat. When behavior is no longer tied to identity evaluation, the brain can engage without self-consciousness. Effort becomes functional rather than expressive. This reduces fatigue. Softening also protects against disappointment. When a goal remains rigid and explicit, unmet expectations linger. The brain continues to reference an ideal that no longer fits the current moment. When the resolution softens, the system updates automatically. It no longer compares the present to an outdated image of the future. Comparison fades. Without comparison, there is less need for adjustment. The brain simply continues forward with what it has learned. Importantly, softening does not mean forgetting. The intention remains available. It can reappear if needed. It can become explicit again during another transition. The brain retains access without holding tension. This flexibility preserves trust. The system knows it can return to intention without restarting or justifying. Nothing has been lost. Nothing needs to be reclaimed. Softening also allows space for other priorities to emerge. Life changes. Context shifts. Energy reallocates. The brain adapts without feeling like it has abandoned something important. Adaptation is smooth. This is why many people realize months later that a resolution influenced them more than they thought. the influence did not come from constant effort, but from quiet integration. The resolution did not need to be remembered. It needed to be absorbed. In biological systems, absorption is a sign of completion. Not completion as an endpoint, but completion as incorporation. The behavior, insight, or awareness has been taken in. Once incorporated, it no longer needs attention. This is the moment when change feels natural, when it no longer feels like change at all, when the system simply operates differently without commentary. Letting the resolution soften allows this process to finish. There is no announcement, no milestone, no conclusion, just a gradual quieting. And within that quiet, the influence remains, steady, unforced, and already part of how the year continues to unfold. By the time the year has unfolded for a while, something becomes clear. There was no true beginning, and there is no real ending. The calendar changed, but life continued. Days followed days. Routines shifted, then settled. Some intentions stayed visible. Others dissolved quietly into the background. Nothing was lost in that process. From a biological perspective, humans do not reset. They continue. The brain carries forward what it has learned, whether it is named or not. Experience accumulates even when attention moves on. This is how adaptation works. New Year's resolutions often fade not because they failed, but because they are no longer needed in their original form. They have already influenced perception, attention, and behavior. Their work is done quietly. The year does not restart. It deepens. What once felt intentional becomes ordinary. What once required thought becomes habit. What once felt uncertain becomes familiar. These transitions rarely announce themselves. They happen in the background, where the nervous system prefers to work. The benefit of a resolution does not depend on whether it is remembered. It depends on whether it was absorbed. An absorption does not require constant effort. It happens through repetition, reflection, and time. Time is the key element. Time allows the brain to integrate without pressure. It smooths sharp edges. It reduces emotional charge. It turns experiences into reference points rather than events. As the months pass, the brain no longer needs the resolution to orient itself. Orientation has already been established. Attention has already shifted. Learning has already occurred. The system moves forward using what it has gathered. This is why change often feels subtle when it is real. There is no moment where everything clicks into place. No single day that marks success. Instead, there is a gradual sense that certain choices feel easier, certain reactions feel softer, certain directions feel more natural. These are not dramatic outcomes. They are stable ones. The year continues not as a test of commitment, but as a lived process. The brain adjusts as circumstances change. It revisits intentions when useful and releases them when they no longer serve. Nothing needs to be held tightly. The nervous system is designed for continuity. It prefers flow over force. When change aligns with that preference, it lasts without effort. New Year's resolutions, viewed this way, are not promises to be kept or broken. They are moments of orientation. Moments where the brain briefly pauses, reorganizes, and looks ahead. What happens after that pause unfolds naturally, shaped by context, capacity, and time. Whether the resolution is remembered or forgotten does not determine its value. The value lies in the pause itself, in the quiet reordering, in the brief openness, in the permission to imagine what might come next. Once that permission has been granted, the system knows what to do. The year does not need to be managed. It continues. And within that continuation, the influence of intention remains, not as a goal to pursue, but as a subtle shaping force, already woven into how life is lived, moment by moment, without requiring attention or effort. Nothing more is needed. The year moves on.